Okay, so this continues our discussion of events that are happening in the Latin East up to 1144, in particular, the sort of factionalism that's really sort of disrupting the Crusader kingdoms, particularly Jerusalem and Antioch. And as that factionalism and internal division sort of weakens the Crusader kingdoms, you have at the same time an intensification of sort of these ideas of jihad and religious war, sort of transforming the Muslim world. And so, in this period, you really do have, in the aftermath of sort of the Crusades of 1101 and 1108, a lack of real sort of commitment in the West to any sort of sustained military maneuver. So, there are constantly individuals with smaller groups sort of going down to the Latin East, helping them fight for a time, bringing new resources, but you don't see sort of the large mobilization of the First Crusade. In part, it's not only because 1101 and 1108 were relatively unsuccessful in accomplishing anything, but the Crusaders who are coming back, who have returned, even the Crusaders from the First Crusade, they may bring back some relics. But that's about it. So there is very little evidence of material gain. And on the flip side, a lot of them end up quite impoverished. This is not a money-making endeavor. You have considerable unrest during in some of these principalities. So local nobles have to sort of weigh the sort of gains of a crusade against what's going to happen in these power vacuums that they leave. So if they're not fully in control of their territory, to what extent might they be vulnerable? Increasingly too, and this is only going to become worse after the Second Crusade, is a lot of the Crusaders don't no longer feel sort of an affinity for the Franks who are now living in the Latin East. They just see them as different. They see them as too assimilated, and they don't always have the same goals. And then especially after 1108 with sort of the Bohemans' attack of the Byzantine Empire, they no longer have sort of a clear ally in the Byzantine emperors. And so obviously moving forward, that's going to create sort of new challenges. But in 1144, the fall of Edessa really does sort of send shockwaves across not just the Latin East, but up into Western Europe as well. So Jocelyn is the Count of Edessa. He succeeds after Baldwin leaves Edessa to become king. Jocelyn does not have the best relationships with some of his neighbors, particularly Prince Raymond of Antioch, which we discussed before. In this particular moment, so you can see Edessa here on the map is sort of a good-sized county. Trebessel is one of the capitals, and it's sort of in the east. And Edessa is closer to the north. In November, Zengi arrives and he lays siege to the city. And he does this is timed perfectly because he knows that Jocelyn and the majority of his forces are not in the city of Edessa. They're at Trebessel. And so Zengi lays siege to the city. Jocelyn does appeal for help. However, Raymond of Antioch, who is the closest, because of the animosity that they have for each other, ignores Jocelyn's appeal. Queen Melisande does dispatch an army, but as you can see from this map, it's going to take a lot longer for that army to arrive. And this ends up being a relatively short siege. So in the 23rd of December, Muslim sappers, so these are individuals who dig under the walls. So both sides are becoming pretty adept at siege warfare. So these sappers light a fire. So they dig underneath the wall and then you light a fire and that further weakens the structure. Ideally, then that part of the wall collapses and you're able to enter the city. And that's exactly what happens. They also have some siege equipment. You can see sort of the demonstration here. They're using sort of a trebuchet to launch very large rocks or missiles against the walls and try and sort of further weaken the walls. On the 24th of December, then the Turks are able to enter the city through a breach in the walls. The people that they find, for the most part, are slaughtered. Some do sort of manage to flee to the citadel, which is sort of the fortress within the city walls, and they are hoping to hold out until Jocelyn can arrive. Eventually, though, by January, They've completely run out of any sort of provisions. There is no indication that any relief force is on the way anytime soon. And so those few survivors are forced to surrender. And so we know that most of the adult men, the highest ranking nobles, would be kept as prisoners and then ransomed. Most of the other men are killed. The women and children of Edessa are enslaved. They're a majority Armenian population, so they are mostly Christians. 7 towers of the city are destroyed to make it sort of easier for the Muslims to establish control. And obviously, the strategic importance of Edessa cannot be understated. It really does provide that key buffer against those Turkish forces in the north, but also made it sort of so that Zengi, working from his sort of territory in Aleppo and Mosul, had to sort of divide his attention between Edessa and Antioch. And obviously with the fall of Edessa, he's able to completely focus all his attention on Antioch. So Raymond of Poitiers makes a really, really huge mistake here. It is in his best interest to keep Jocelyn and the Franks in control of Edessa, and obviously that does not happen. So immediately after the fall of Edessa, Queen Melisende appeals directly to the Pope, Eugenius III. There are also a number of different pilgrims and prelates, sort of high-ranking members of the church in the Latin East, who individually go to Western Europe to sort of preach and request aid, to sort of spread this message of what had happened. Pope Eugenius III in 1145, so right after the fall, does issue a call for a crusade. So it's a papal bull. It's called, the title of it is Quantum Predicasoris. And this is sort of remnants of Urban II's call at Clermont. He very much tries to motivate individuals to take up the cross, sort of a large-scale mobilization, very much emulating the First Crusade. He promises complete remission of sins. Even if you don't die, you still will go to heaven if you take the oath and make a good effort. Protection for the families and the lands that Crusaders will be leaving behind. He tries to expand some of the incentives from those offered by Urban. So if you are in debt to anyone, you do not have to pay interest during the time that you're gone. And if you come back, those debts will be wiped free. But he does not get sort of the response. In part, he is sort of responding to some of the failed efforts of these previous crusades, like 1101 and 1108. And so he does say, look, this is a spiritual endeavor. If you are going to go, you need to sort of be prudent. And he actually prohibits them from bringing, to quote him, things which portend licentiousness. So don't wear expensive clothes, don't bring dogs or falcons, so you're not going to hunt. We should really limit the number of prostitutes that go along. And at the end of the day, whether it's because there's just not the enthusiasm or because he sort of blunts that sort of ability to motivate individuals with his sort of focus on sort of the seriousness of this endeavor, we know that there's very little response. Until Bernard, the abbot of Clairvaux, who is one of the, if not the, leading church figures of this period, takes this upon himself personally to try and mobilize support and interest in the crusade. Bernard is already known as a very, very charismatic preacher. He's extraordinarily ascetic, so he fasts constantly. He lives a very sort of pious life. He is associated with a variety of miracles. And so he goes from sort of court to court across Western Europe and attempts to convince individual nobles that they should join this effort. He also writes a number of letters, and some of them are extant, trying to encourage people who he can't meet with personally. Remember, it's Bernard who wrote the rule for the Knights Templar, so he is very intimately sort of engaged with control of Jerusalem. He visits Conrad, the King of Germany, personally in his capital at Frankfurt to try and put pressure on him to go. And we also know that in the midst of all of this other activity, Bernard personally intervenes There is a preacher, a local preacher in northern France and Germany, who again is trying to use this sort of anti-Christian rhetoric being proposed, sort of centered around the crusade, to target Jewish communities. And Bernard personally sort of intervenes. He meets with that preacher. He says, this is not at all what we want to do. We are not talking about targeting Jews. We're talking about targeting Muslims. He sends a letter to the Archbishop of Mainz, sort of denouncing the actions and the discourse of this preacher, and sort of dismissing him as heretical and not authorized. And he says very clearly, look, the conversion here, or our goal regarding the Jews is different than our goal regarding Muslims. We want to convert Jews, not kill them. And this is sort of an iconic image of Bernard. He writes a lot about sort of piety centered around the Virgin Mary, who is depicted here as sort of nurturing Bernard spiritually, and he is very effective in sort of getting much more enthusiasm for the Second Crusade, and in particular identifying leaders. One of those leaders then is King Louis VII of France. Louis is extremely pious to begin with. He was actually the younger son who probably was raised to go into the church, but his older brother sort of died when he was in his teens. And so then Louis becomes the heir, though he's not really suited to being King of France in many ways. He lacks any sort of military abilities, but he is very suited in some respects to crusade, because he is so committed to these ideas, these spiritual ideas sort of that percolate around the idea of crusade. So he initially announces his intention at his Christmas court of taking the cross and going on crusade in response to Eugenius III's call. But a lot of his nobles and even some of the high-ranking members of the church in France do not think this is a good idea. France is really experiencing a lot of pressure in the north from the English, and so they do not feel that his absence is a good idea. But eventually he arranges a meeting with the Pope. The Pope then sort of assures all of the nobles of France that this is indeed what Louis is meant to do, and the Pope sort of designates him the leader of the forces of the Second Crusade. In 1146 then, in the spring of 1146, so it's on Palm Sunday, so obviously a central sort of day in making this connection between the Second Crusade and Jerusalem. He appears at the Cathedral of Vézelay with Bernard of Clairvaux. There's preaching. There's a lot of sort of spiritual fervor. And so many men decide to sort of take the oath that they have these little like fabric crosses. They run out of them. And the story says that the response is so overwhelming. They run out of these little cloth crosses that Bernard starts tearing off strips of his monk's habit and putting a red cross on it to give to the men. We also know that Louis's wife, Eleanor, decided that she was going to accompany him. Eleanor is a very interesting figure in history. She was a wealthy heiress. She and Louis married when they were about 14 and 15. The marriage is not going well. They seem to have very different personalities. It was a very sort of politically expedient marriage. But we do know that she goes along with a large number of noble women and a retinue of about 300 other women. So this is going to add a new dimension to the crusade. Women, wives, probably a few here and there did accompany the First Crusade, but this sort of large contingent of noble women with all their baggage, like their literal baggage, all their household items, is going to sort of present a new challenge to the army. And you can see the depiction here of Louis and Eleanor, and they're being sort of blessed on this endeavor by Bernard, and then they set off on crusade on June of 1147. So Bernard is successful in his attempts to convince Conrad III to go along. He is very reluctant. He's just come off of civil war in the Holy Roman Empire. He still has individuals who are challenging his right to rule, but we know that Bernard puts a lot of pressure on him. He stays at his court for a while preaching. There are stories of some miracles that he performs. And so eventually Conrad does agree to go. He is accompanied by his half-brother Odo, who is Bishop of Freising. Odo actually does write quite a bit. He intends to go along so that he can produce a narrative of the Second Crusade. But we know that after they come back, he actually decides that he's not going to do that because it was just such a failure that he's not interested in writing the history of something that was so unsuccessful. But in any case, this is sort of Conrad leading his troops through Hungary. And they depart on May 1147, just a month before the French troops. So we do have an attempt by Conrad and Louis to sort of coordinate their troops, how they're going to get through Western Europe into to the Byzantine Empire and then sort of meet up around Constantinople. They have learned the lessons of their predecessors in the need to provide food and provisions along the way. We know that the numbers who respond to the call for the Second Crusade are probably even higher than the numbers of those who respond to the First Crusade. It's certainly a much more diverse group of soldiers. You actually have a significant contingent from England and Flanders, also obviously from France and Germany. We do know that a group of them that takes a sea route ends up being diverted to Iberia, modern day Spain, and they end up successfully joining some of the Iberian troops in the port city of Lisbon and retaking Lisbon from Muslim control. The rest, and then they either stay in Lisbon or they go back home. The rest of the troops then continue the march for the most part overland. When they get to sort of the edges of the Byzantine Empire, they are forced to sort of negotiate with the Emperor Manuel. He says, look, I'll give you supplies, I'll give you access to Byzantine markets, but you have to promise sort of oaths of allegiance in return. There's a lot of reluctance to swear these oaths, but eventually both Louis and Conrad do. However, even though they do, they still don't have sort of the access to the markets that they need to really provision such large armies. And increasingly, they're having a harder and harder time just finding food and basic provisions. So Conrad gets to Constantinople first. Manuel helps him and his soldiers cross the Bosporus. Once he does, he gets to Nicaea. He decides to divide his army into two. So half are going to take the coastal route, which is longer, but it's in Byzantine-controlled lands, and they think it'll be safer. The other half decides to take the land route, and this is the larger group. They take the land route that was followed by the First Crusaders. This is going to be through Turkish territories, and almost immediately they encounter a large Turkish force at Dorylaeum. They are annihilated. The German forces are annihilated. Conrad barely manages to escape, though he's wounded. He goes back to Nicaea to wait for Louis and the French army because he just doesn't even have the men to allow him to proceed any further. Eventually, Louis and the French army do arrive. You can see this is a mural that's actually just recently been rediscovered during some renovations of a church in France. And this is supposed to be Eleanor and one of her ladies sort of on crusade. They connect with Conrad and they decide to sort of proceed forward alongst the land route. However, Louis's army is constantly harassed by sort of Turkish forces in the mountains. It's very, very difficult to get through this steep, rocky terrain with the horses and the baggage trains and all of these people. They also then suffer They suffer along the way because they're being attacked by these small groups of Muslims. And eventually, though, what Louis decides to do, because it's just sort of a war of attrition between not being able to provide food for his men and all the women and all the retainers who are with them, and between sort of losing a dozen men here, a dozen men there, he decides the smartest path is actually to take ships. So instead of this long, arduous land route that the first Crusaders took, he's going to divert his army to the port city of Adalia, and then at least the horses and the knights can go by boat and everyone else can go by foot. But actually that diversion itself through these really, really steep mountain passes they end up losing more people than they probably would have if they stayed on the original route. And he's just having an enormous challenge trying to keep his men in line. So we know throughout the entire trip, there's a lack of discipline. Individuals at one point on this sort of trip through the mountains, they go up the pass, and then as they begin to descend, there's sort of a stampede. Horses fall off cliffs to their death. So do men. They sort of trample each other, though eventually he does reach the port and he is able to sail to Antioch. In the meantime, Conrad falls ill. Shortly after they get to this, and so he goes back to Constantinople and then eventually to Ephesus to recover. So as obviously has been illustrated, there's an incredible lack of organization amongst these armies. And in particular, a lot of this is due to the lack of strong leadership, particularly on the part of Louis. As I said, he's very, very pious, but he's not necessarily a strong commander. There also is, they're not getting support from the local Byzantines that they thought they would. So in some instances, when the Christian armies are attacked, they're actually attacked by local Byzantine settlers. There's tension between the French and the Germans, even though they've combined their forces. The French are angry because the Germans sort of preceded them. And so the French blame the Germans for not being able to get provisions because they say the Germans sort of used them all. And then Louis VII he tries to control the men in his army. So he forbids looting and pillaging. He forbids plundering and any sort of theft of any goods. And he implements some really, really harsh penalties. So we know that there are instances when he has people who are guilty of theft, their ears are cut off or their hands or their feet. But no matter how harsh the response, these sort of actions continue. So eventually they do arrive in Antioch, and they have to formulate a plan. And again, this is sort of when things go off the rails because, as if they could go anywhere off the rails, because they're just two different agendas. So Raymond, the Prince of Antioch, says our target should be Aleppo. That's where the Muslims have been using as a base of operations. If we can take Aleppo from them, then we can move from Aleppo into Edessa and reclaim Edessa, which is totally logical considering the reason why they're here to begin with. However, Louis is, for a number of reasons, just not really interested in that plan. He's not interested in targeting Aleppo. He's even less interested in Edessa. In part, Raymond is astute in this sort of plan. In 1146, so not long after the fall of Edessa, Zengi was assassinated. And he's succeeded by one of his sons, Nur al-Din. So Nur al-Din gets Aleppo and another son gets Mosul. So he's divided up, well, he was dead. So they divide up his empire, which actually leaves Nur al-Din in a weaker sort of position, and he has to sort of consolidate his control. So if you're going to target Aleppo, this would have been an ideal time. But Louis remains obstinate. There's lots of stories about what happens when they're in Antioch. Eleanor is actually the niece of Raymond of Antioch. They apparently have a very cordial relationship. Eleanor supports Raymond. Remember, Eleanor and Louis aren't getting along so well to begin with, so it's not really clear what happens. There are some suggestions that Eleanor engaged in an inappropriate relationship with Raymond. Is probably not true. There's a lot of negative propaganda about Eleanor circulating at this time amongst churchmen anyway, but we do know that Louis at some point just says enough, and they sort of leave Antioch in the middle of the night. Eleanor wants to stay, and Louis forces her to go along with him. So this is a slightly later image of Raymond sort of welcoming Louis to Antioch. So then they get to Jerusalem, and by this time Conrad has returned. They consult with Baldwin III and Queen Melisende at Acre, so they have a council there. And they try and figure out what the target then is going to be. In a very bizarre and inconsistent move, they choose Damascus as their target, which, maybe 20 years previous to this would have made sense. But Damascus, even though it's controlled by a Muslim political leader, just recently entered into an alliance with the Kingdom of Jerusalem because Damascus was worried that Zengi and the Nur al-Din were going to try and take it over. They did not want that to happen. So Damascus at this time is an ally of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So why they would target an ally is a little befuddling. But they do. They mobilize an enormous army. They lay siege to the city of Damascus. Initially, things are going quite well. They are actually able to sort of find a spot along the walls that's a little bit weaker. They have access to food and water. But then for some reason, and the sources are really conflicting on why, they decide to move to another side of the city and attack a different side of the wall. That side ends up being much stronger. And also, as they leave sort of this orchard where they were initially, they no longer have access to water, and they quickly run through their provisions. They also hear reports that Nur al-Din has been sort of called in. Nur al-Din was married to the daughter of the ruler of Damascus. So it makes sense that when given this threat from the Christian armies, the ruler of Damascus would appeal to Nur al-Din. So things all of a sudden not going as well. Reports that Nur al-Din's army is about to show up. And so after only 4 days, they decide to retreat and they return to Jerusalem, and it's just a complete rout. This is a manuscript showing the three kings, so Baldwin, Louis, and Conrad, and showing the Crusaders' attempt to conquer Damascus. So after that, Conrad goes home. Louis and Eleanor hang out in Jerusalem for about another year. He just visits all the sites and really sort of connects to his piety. Some of his advisors start to say after a month or two, look, we really need to get back. But in part, it could be that he just doesn't want to face the failure that was the Second Crusade. So you do see in a lot of writings, people point fingers directly at Bernard of Clairvaux. He made promises that he couldn't keep. And Bernard sort of responds directly and says, look, it wasn't me. I can't control God. We all know that these crusades fail or succeed because of divine intervention. And clearly in this case, God did not want them to succeed. Or the Crusaders were too sinful, or they just sort of lost their way. And so there's a lot of blame thrown around from a lot of different sources. But at the end of the day, in this complete sort of absence of any sort of accomplishment, Crusade enthusiasm in the West is going to continue to wane. The tension between sort of the Latin Christians and the Byzantine Greeks is just going to continue to increase. Not only did they fail to provide any sort of support, they actually undermined the efforts of a lot of the Crusaders. And then the other thing you see reflected in a lot of the writings, so Louis has so he has his own sort of chronicler who goes along. This is Odo of Doi, who writes an account of the Second Crusade. And he says, look, a lot of what we found, we just couldn't believe because these Latin Christians are almost inseparable from these Muslims. They're wearing Muslim dress, which actually they were not. They eat Muslim food. They bathe daily like the Muslims. And so there's a lot of sort of accusations that these clear divisions between the Franks who've settled there and the people coming down on Crusade are no longer easily sort of identified. And William of Tyre even tells us that after the Second Crusade, a lot of the people in the West just didn't have the same level of sort of love and desire to protect Jerusalem because they did not respect the people who'd settled there. But the message, the takeaway for those Latin Christians in the Kingdom of Jerusalem and Antioch is really from now on, you're on your own. You cannot rely on sort of large-scale support from the West in these moments of weakness. If you're going to maintain your position, you're going to have to do it yourself.